Lovely. So welcome to today's Tech Hour. It's a bit of an experiment in that it's putting together various different ideas relating to accessibility and user experience. And I'd be pleased if people could introduce themselves just briefly. Maybe Patrick or Kelly could go first.
I can go first. Hi, all. I'm Patrick Smith. I am a, well, I guess where to start first, but I am kind of multi-things right now. I am starting a new business called IOTA School, where I provide accessible technical training for organizations, and also a postdoctoral fellow at City University of New York here in New York City. And I'm a blind developer. I have a PhD in English.
So not your usual techie.
Yeah, though I am pretty into it. I do a lot of Python programming.
Okay, we'll have some Python here. So your visually impaired experience of Python will actually be really valuable. Kelly.
Thanks, Jonathan. My name's Kelly Johnson, and I'm a scientist for the United States government. I work for NOAA, and I work on fisheries issues. And the reason that I joined this group is because we write really large documents using Markdown and LaTeX that integrate a lot of tables and figures, and it's hard to make them accessible.
Paulius, William?
Hello, can you hear me right?
Yes, we hear you good.
Okay, so I'm Paulius from capital of Lithuania, Vilnius. I'm now the student of software engineering at Vilnius Tech University, now in the third year of studies. And I'm interested in, as I'm blind from birth, I'm interested in various things that relates to accessibility for blind and visually impaired people. Primarily now I'm interested in PHP programming, and I'm planning to start working there soon. And a short story about LaTeX and why this event is kind of interesting to me to see is that I'm reading LaTeX material to understand the mathematics better. And one thing that I recently did was just chosen the introduction to LaTeX course that was available in our university. And now I'm just happy going through various LaTeX basics and see how Lithuanian lecturers are implementing documents in LaTeX. So it's like a great experience for me. So for short, maybe that's all.
Well, good luck with your studies, and it's nice to hear from you again.
Thanks.
And it's a beautiful city. I've been there a couple of times. William?
Hello, I'm an old retired programmer, and I like using and learning about LaTeX.
That's short and sweet. I know that Nelson isn't retired.
No, I'm still busy working here. We're in the middle of a term break and also a weather change where 10 days ago we were plus 20 and now it's minus 10. 20 centimeters of snow. I go back a long ways in the tech community, right back to the late 1970s when tech was getting started at Stanford. So I've had a long time involvement with tech and LaTeX and DVI drivers and many other things tech related and BibTech related.
So I think we've got a lot of experience between us, and it's not all the shame experience. We can learn from each other. And last month we had Alice Merrick come and tell us about the work she and her Google colleagues did on the accessibility of command line interfaces. And I'm going to start sharing the screen. Why is it? Let's try that one. No, wrong one. Sorry, I'm having difficulty. There we go. So the recommendations that Alice and her team gave at her paper discussed at last week's meeting were: make sure that a HTML version of all documentation is available. Provide a way to translate long outputs into another accessible format. Document the output structure for each command. Provide a way to translate tables in command line interface output to another accessible format. That's going to be really important for us. Tables also mean things lined up on top of each other. And think of monospaced fonts if you're a sighted person. Ensure that all commands provide status and progress indication. That's not relevant to us today. And that these indicators are screen reader friendly. And there's a final one: ensure that error messages are understandable when read aloud. Well, I'm going to add to that one, which is ensure that error messages are appropriate and understand when read visually. Because the next topic is something I saw actually a week ago, Thursday, the 3rd of March. And the people who are not sighted won't be able to see this because I'm showing you a video screen share. So that's a big problem we've already encountered today about accessibility, is that screen sharing over video doesn't work for blind people or visually impaired people. So I'll read out the message. It's from, I can't pronounce the name properly, but I'll have a go. It's Nguyen Ngoc Tien. Hi all, I'm using Notepad to write Python code, but in some cases, when I write code and execute it on the command line, the Python said invalid sequence. Here is my code example. Now we get to the crux of the whole thing, and I'll read it out. Count equals 0, while count less than 1, count equals count plus 1, print count, break, else, print, no break. When running the code, the system said else, invalid syntax. At this point, I have to tell you one of the features of Python that I very rarely use and always puzzle over when I do use it, which is that a while loop can have an else statement. And I can't remember which round it is, but the else statement, I think the else statement is executed if there's a break. Oh, if there's not a break in the loop. I'm not sure which way around it goes, but depending on how the loop exits, the loop can exit either because the condition is false or because there's a break. And the else is executed in one of those things. But never mind what happened. He never got to that point because it said invalid syntax. Now, what I didn't read out to you was the indentations. And Python uses indentations to provide the block structure, or if you prefer, the tree structure that all modern programming languages use. And as a sighted person, I can scan my eyes up and down and see that the stuff in the while loop is all properly indented until we get to the break. And the break is at the same level as the while loop. So that is not allowed because it's not inside the while loop, so to speak, on the edge of the while loop. And then underneath there's an indented else. And actually, the else should not be indented. Now that's more explanation than we need. What I saw when I read this was what's going on here? Because the first error in the code is in the break. And the system says the else is the error. So this is a sort of narrative. It's a sort of round the houses and back again narrative.
if I'm not mistaken, the break statement in Python only X's the actual loop, but here it was the if statement, but not the loop. So maybe here was the problem.
Well, the problem I saw was that the first error in the code, the first syntax error in the code, was that the break wasn't. You can only have break inside a loop. You can't break outside. You can't break out of something that's not a loop. You can't break out of jail unless you're already in jail. And the programmer had put the break at the same level as the while. And so it's not inside the while loop. And that's fine, that's just a mistake. But Python didn't spot that. It said that there's a problem with the else. I expected Python to report the first error in the input source, and it didn't. My expectation was that Python would report the first error in the input source. Do other people have a similar or different expectation?
Well, the else, it would still be a syntax error because it's the break. Yeah, that's interesting. Well, the else, it would be a syntax error because it wouldn't consider the else to be within the while loop. So there is a syntax error with the else in a sense, right?
Oh yeah, yeah.
But it's not the first. I wonder if break might be allowed out of. I wonder if break is allowed outside of a loop.
No,
it's not. So
because there's nowhere to go. Just as return is not allowed outside.
What is it, a logical error or a syntax error?
It's a syntax error because you can detect it without executing the code that you compile.
Right.
A syntax error is something that prevents you compiling the code. Whereas this is in Python, whereas a runtime error is something that happens wrong when you run the code. So let's put it a different way. As an expert, I read that code and I saw that the break statement not being indented was the first error. And I wondered, shouldn't Python report the first error first? Shouldn't it be eager to report errors? And in a sense, that would have helped the user fix the code because he could incrementally fix the errors as Python found them. Whereas we don't know that the error with break is causing an error further on, so that sort of working steadily from top to bottom, fixing the errors, means you don't have to go back and fix things later the second time. I think we're sort of laboring something here. This was a starting point of an investigation. And I had the point of view of what can we do to help beginner Python programmers, because the person is clearly a beginner, who also happen to be visually disabled, possibly blind. And already there's a problem, which is that the error message doesn't help. So perhaps unusually, let's see if we can do this. I actually filed a bug. Let's make it a bit bigger. I actually filed.
Jonathan, I have a question.
Yeah.
I'm not a Python coder, so I don't really know, but if you take out the else statement, would the code compile?
No, because there's an error in the break. The break is not properly indented.
Okay, thank you.
Okay, but if you took out the else statement, that's actually really important because that's what we're going to do. If you took out the else statement, then you get an error that's earlier than the one you took out. So the title of this is Compiler Errors That Happen Before Syntax Errors Are Not Reported First. Compiler errors that happen before syntax errors are not reported first. That's not my title. It came out of negotiation between myself and the person who handled the bug, who's a senior programmer for Python, who's got responsibilities for the compiler. And I report what happened. And here's something that wasn't reported, which was when it wasn't in the original report from Negan. When I save the material to a file, I try and run Python on it, and I get the else on one line, and then on the next line, there's a little caret, a little up arrow that points to the beginning of else. Now, that violates one of our rules, doesn't it? Because this is a table. The only way a blind person can know what's being pointed to is by counting spaces and counting characters. And I then did what Kelly did, sort of said, which is remove the last two lines and you get the break outside the loop. And finally, because Python programmers say you should always use 4 spaces for your indent, but from what I've heard, for blind programmers, space, 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 space is a bit verbose, and they just prefer 1 space equals 1 indent, which in the old-fashioned world, which is highly disapproved of, use tabs for indents. Early Python programmers used tabs for indents, perhaps to save space or typing, but now that sort of stuff is taken care of with the editor. So there's a lot of stuff there, and Pablo Galindo Salgo says, well, we can't do anything really here because that's the way the parser's constructed. And the parser does things in its particular order. And so it reports the first error it finds. And he finishes by saying, being said that, if someone devises some easy way to do this without major changes everywhere, I'm happy to reopen it. Well, I always like a challenge. And I found a way to fix it. And the fix gives the output that there's an indentation error, but it also gives the break error. And it is basically what Kelly suggested, which is once you get to the indentation error, you have a look at where the error occurred, and Python will tell you that. And you truncate the file at that point. So Python will never find the indentation error that it just reported because you've removed it from what's being compiled. And then I'll have a go to see if there's an earlier error, and it gets it. So I submitted a bit of code that does that, and Pablo says, that doesn't really work. It's too complicated to do it properly. It's not worth it. I'm going to leave it as won't fix. And then I beg, my main concern is that the door is not closed to improving the user experience. And so I say, why don't we close it as not a bug? This is what the compiler should do, and have another piece of software be responsible for reporting the errors nicely. So he gets what he wants, which is he doesn't get extra work on his plate that doesn't bring any benefit to anything he sees. He's a senior developer that works for a major company. Whereas I've got a sensitivity to people who are beginners and visually disabled like Neugen. And I say, we don't even have to do it inside core Python. Pablo accepts essentially what I said, and then he gives a very helpful link to Andre Roberge, who is the author of the Friendly and Friendly Traceback, which is a third-party package already along the lines of what I'm suggesting. So that's a real bonus that I wasn't expecting, and I didn't know about that package at all. So how are we doing? Time to take breath, I think, and time for me to stop talking. And allow other people to come in.
I just want to say that that's pretty cool, what you did with this bug and the effort you put in. I really appreciate it. That's really cool. And it's a really interesting like edge case, I guess, you know what I mean, that has sort of been found here. And it sounds like there's two different steps, that it looks for one type of error first and then the other type of error, and that's why you get the later error before the first error. Is that correct? Or?
Yeah, it sort of builds a tree first, and then it has to look to see if what is in the tree is correct. So it builds a tree, and as far as it's concerned, break is just a statement like x equals 2. Break is no different from x equals 2 is a statement that can appear wherever a statement can appear. Whereas break requires the parent to be a loop, some parent to be a loop. Tech, by the way, has a similar problem, that you make a mistake and in your markup, and then you get this enormous traceback sometimes that can come considerably longer. Tech is not eager to tech is not eager to detect errors. Tech detect errors.
And then some of the errors are really like they're really in the first person. Like it's like I didn't work.
Yeah. So tech's got a few features for catching errors before they get too far. One of them is that a macro argument can't include a paragraph break unless you explicitly allow it to. And so that stops a missing curly brace from gobbling your whole document. You know, it's terrible if you miss a curly brace at one point and the error message is, we've got to the end of the document and we still haven't got your missing brace. There are some other things along those lines. Paulius, how does this fit with your experience? If I can ask you to talk.
You're asking generally about fixing errors in programs, right?
Well, just relate this to your experience, however you like.
Okay, so first thing I just saw that you said that this person who actually wrote this code was using Notepad.
Yeah.
So my main concern is that yes, even he's a beginner in Python programming, but in general, from my experience and from other developers, such a knowledge Notepad program for writing. So Notepad for writing programs is, let's say, like a nonsense because
very bad, right? You'd want to use Notepad++.
Yes, but even Notepad++ is still not the best option. The best thing I've
not for Python
seen is maybe main Python interpreter, but maybe more better idea is to use VS Code because it has a great linting tool, great formatters, where you just press Alt-Shift-F and all the code gets formatted in seconds. And you don't need to care about spaces, tabs, and all the other great features that good IDE does for you. And you don't need to think about maybe doc blocks or some other features that just IDE can do for you. So there is no need to do some stuff while IDE can do it for you. So that's the problem number one I see from this experience, because developers, even from the junior position, but they need to switch to IDEs instead of simple Notepad. Just my experience that later on it will be very difficult to write programs quickly without help of IDE. And for correcting errors, yes, it's quite a common thing in programmers life. Just command line here is very helpful for us, even in Python, even in other programming languages, because when tracebacks or other errors are outputted straight to the command line, it's fairly easy to catch up, to see the error messages and just fix them one by one. So that's the job of the programmer and its daily life. So yes, maybe that's all from my point of view.
Okay, I'll leave that to sit where it is. On Monday, there was a job advertisement on the UK Python list. Their company is looking for its third employee in Edinburgh, and they want the person to work or be near Edinburgh. I'll read out a bit from the announcement. My name is Will McGugan. I'm creator of Rich and Textual and founder and CEO of Textualize. He's taken a year off his open source projects, and he's got some venture capital money, and he's looking for a third Python developer to join the company. Now, what will you be working on is a Python text user interface. So it's not a command line interface, but it's a text user interface. So typically you use the keyboard only to manipulate a text display. And the old word processing programs were like that, and some file managers were like that, for example. So it's a souped up command line interface, and in fact, you can use a text user interface as a component in a command line script. And he also mentioned that we've got some interesting problems to solve. Create a powerful API that a beginner can use within an hour. How to make the terminal more beautiful, whatever that means. Beautiful is in the eye of the beholder or the ear of the hearer. And what we can do to improve accessibility for non-Western language users and the vision impaired. So I popped him an email and told him about this list and the conversation we had last week and various other things. And I started exploring his work and some other related work. I did that, I think, yesterday. Okay. So for the people that are cited, I've created a file called funnybreakerror.py, which is exactly what Neugen posted to the blind list. And there's another program called Black, and it's named after Henry Ford.
You can have any color you want as long as it's black.
Yeah, it's a very opinionated formatter. The first thing to do is to try to run Black on this thing. And it says, error, cannot format funnybreakerror.py, cannot pass 6:0:, else colon. And that's it. And it's got some emoji, it's got some, what's the word, emoticons of a broken heart and two shells exploding. And by the way, that uses the program Rich to display the text on the screen that Will McDuggan provided. Oh, and it's all in red and white and bold. It's sort of bit half HTML-ish, if you like. So Black won't deal with anything that can't be parsed. And in some sense, that's brilliant because it understands the program very well, because it uses what's called the abstract syntax tree, and then it rewrites the output from the abstract syntax tree. So if we
why are there emojis? It's just there for fun, or?
Sorry?
What are the emojis signifying, like semantically?
Semantically, what they're signifying is that that something's crashed and there's a broken heart. Something sad has happened due to violence. That's roughly speaking the context for this. I'm gonna sorry. corrected. This is the corrected file, and Black will run on that. And it says it's fixed everything, and we've got a piece of cake and some pleasant Christmas decorations, which I have to say sort of half irritated and half entertained me when I saw that. It's sort of giving me a reward. But these rewards are things that are being communicated to the sighted program, and to the blind programmer, you'd probably want some applause or a raspberry to indicate success or failure. Audio.
Well,
If you're
in theory, those emojis could be represented by the screen. I know mine kind of, the one I use to use Python now kind of doesn't really handle it, but I think in theory, right, those are represented by, you know, symbols that could be interpreted, right?
Yeah. It's the same problem, but it's a question of where do we fix it? And we're actually back to the command line interface that Alice Merrick was talking about last month. How do we handle this sort of stuff? I'll show you what Rich does. So Rich takes the file and it's colorized it to indicate the semantic parts of every part of the file. It does it fairly well. And for what it's worth, Rich doesn't require the file to be valid, whereas Black does. So they're both doing similar things, but Rich is more forgiving on its input. Now, I mentioned earlier the friendly traceback, and if I can find the right, okay. I'm going to run Python. I'm going to use friendly to intercept all the output. And we're going to run it on the funny break error. And I don't know if you can see it, but it's drawn a nice box around everything. And it's given some additional help that explains an indentation error occurs when a given line of code is not indented, aligned vertically with the other lines as expected. Python could not understand the code in the file at the location indicated. So it expands out what the errors mean to a beginner, which might or might not be helpful. And it says line 6 identified above is more indented than expected. So it hasn't exactly fixed the problem, and it says it's friendly, but it makes extensive uses of colors and background colors. So it's got 3 background colors and 4 or 5 foreground colors. And if we okay, this is my fix going through friendly, and we get a lot of output, and it's a sort of repetition of what's happened before. And it says a syntax error occurs when Python cannot understand your code. So more work could be done here. But it does tell us that the Python keyword break can only be used inside a for loop or inside a while loop. So there is value there, because the person who's a beginner won't necessarily remember that it has to be used in this setting. For example, the beginner might confuse the break and return commands because they're both sort of go-tos. So I think it's probably time to stop screen sharing and start sort of coming to conclusions. So I'll stop the share. And I'm really grateful to your careful attention in not the most convenient of circumstances. It sounds to me like there's a lot of lessons that could be learned here. I'm going to just say one lesson, which is, well, one version of it is there, but for the grace of God go I. Another version of it is, when somebody makes a mistake or doesn't do what you think is right, have a look at the circumstances surrounding that person and see if there is anything there that contributed to the poor behavior. Well, I don't like that word, but I'll use them. And is there anything you could do to provide that person with more favorable circumstances? So an example of that would be on bugs.python.org, have a category of bug called accessibility. Or have some sort of tag for accessibility. I don't think it exists. I don't think, let me just check. Won't take a moment. Status. It's component, isn't it? We'll have to, yeah, there's the type of bug, there's behavior, crash, compile error, resource usage, security, performance enhancement. We could have accessibility, which is more specific than behavior. We can have accessibility as a bug component. That might just make it a bit easier to help people improve accessibility. That's a sort of improving the infrastructure on the periphery. I'll stop because I've done too much talking already. And I'll ask people to speak from their own experience or to ask questions or contribute however they see fit.
I feel like this thing that comes up a lot is this upstream, downstream thing, right? Like, where do you fix the bugs? Do you try to go upstream and try to get, you know, Python or the compiler or whatever to change things? Or do you try to like handle things downstream? Or do you try to go into these, like this ecosystem of, like, Rich is really interesting because that's becoming popular and it's kind of at the beginning stages of being popular. And maybe an intervention there could make a big difference, you know? So it's like, where do you intervene, I guess, is an interesting question.
I think a lot of that depends on who you are.
Yeah.
You
Or
sort
the
of,
problem, you know?
yeah, you interviewed.
It's like more of a social thing, problem too, than even like,
yeah.
Than a technical thing.
I'm impressed you knew about Rich before. I didn't until Will McDuggan posted.
I listened to this podcast, Talk Python to me, and the person, I think, I don't know, I guess that must have been the person who was on, but someone came on and talked about Rich. Yeah, and it makes very fancy out. Basically, you can override the printing functions and stuff in Python, I believe, and it'll make very fancy, like pretty printed output and everything.
Yeah, the what's it called? The friendly gives you a element inspector that's quite friendly. I believe it or not, it's got tables in it, so everything's visually formatted. And I guess one point of dialogue might be to provide output that is accessible according to the guidelines mentioned by Alice Merrick. So that some HTML form of the table output might be appropriate. I believe that everything here with Rich is done using, I think it's called ANSI escape sequences that allow you to control the color of printing of output and the font of printing of output. And it shouldn't be too difficult to adapt that so that instead of going to a console, it goes to a browser.
So were you saying the rich people are thinking about accessibility like in this next year, or?
This is Will McDuggan is building upon Rich to create Contextualize, and he's got some funding for it from a venture capitalist, and he's keen to improve accessibility. And that's on that basis, I contacted him, and I hope I'm not breaking any confidence here. He expressed some interest. So there's already an ear that might listen.
I'm involved in a thing now, which, I mean, if we get it, I'll talk more about it, but we just wrote a grant to try to improve accessibility in the HTML output for Jupyter notebooks, which is really, the state of accessibility of Jupyter notebooks is really bad. So
it's a very similar problem though, isn't it? You've got something that's historically command line, and we want to make it PDF because that's where the action is, not PDF, HTML, because that's where the action is for the visually disabled. So I would say that what you're working on is a, let's say, related problem to making the output of Rich and software that uses Rich more accessible. Another thing which I've not dug into is the friendly output and its attempts to provide better explanations. So I think dialogue is the main thing. So getting people to talk to each other about things.
I do think awareness event, I feel like we're starting to see the beginning of people caring a little bit more about, like, people care more than they did 5 years ago. I'm hoping in 5 years, you, like, someone who designed something like Rich, like, I hope that people who are in the business of creating, like, who are a little more upstream or creating like outputs, like creating documents that, like, a tool that spits out a document, I hope that that there will be people on most teams who will be like, hey, like, I don't necessarily know how to make this accessible, but I know it's a thing that we need to do before, like, 100,000 people adopt your tool and start using it. And then, you know what I mean? So I don't know.
I got an email from Jonathan Godfrey yesterday, and okay, I'll read out what he said. Novices, on the other hand, often walk into a course on programming and suddenly find they never knew that screen readers had the solution to the problem of not being able to count spaces or tabs. We don't have really good sites that help blind programmers get started. Do you agree with that?
Agreed. I totally agree with that. It's all, the action is right now, it's all on mailing lists. And that was what I was trying to write with that federal grant, but I wasn't able to put in. I was like, let's create some kind of curriculum to get people started with Python. But I didn't get the approval to submit before until, but
I wonder if Palis would tell us a little bit about his getting started with programming and what could have been done more of to help him.
I started quite simply from Pascal language, and it wasn't me like a difficult just like to learn. So I got theory, got things how should it be done, and because of we at school have been working with Pascal on DOS system, it was quite a different experience working with the HAL screen reader, because the computers were based on DOS OS, so it was like a little bit different experience than working on Windows. But actually, I overcame this, understood all the required things, and then when switching to Windows, it wasn't really that hard. Just followed the tutorials. Later on, went to web programming, became interested in PHP. Then things became simpler because there were like better IDEs for Windows built.
when did you get started, Palis, if you don't mind me asking?
I at first touched programming in Pascal for very basic tasks, and then quite soon switched to more powerful, a little bit scripted with Auto IT scripting tool. Then became interested in web programming technology, so started digging deeper in PHP. Then, as NVDA user, switched a little bit to recognized with Python. Then later on became volunteer in translating NVDA into Lithuanian language. So it became just as a starting point of learning Python. And in university, I was learning C++. Was working mainly on terminal, Visual Studio Terminal, CL compiler. And now for a year, I'm building applications with Laravel, PHP Laravel framework. And here I also use VS Code, which is really powerful and awesome thing for programming. And I now really can't imagine the better IDE instead of VS Code because of its powerful features, indentations, fixes, and whatnot. Tried using PHP Storm, but initially failed because of lack of accessibility. In the autumn semester this year, when we had the Java software development course, I also tried using IntelliJ, but it became totally clear to me that JetBrains really doesn't care about accessibility in their products because they don't do anything. They don't get attention to the accessibility problems, same as Postman developers do. They also doesn't seem to be care about it. I just saw various accessibility issues coming from blind people to Postman development team, and they just what they do is they just ignore these. Pretty untypical situation, but I don't know why, but for some development companies, maybe it looks like accessibility is the thing that we are not mainly focused in, and that's why these problems happen. So in this point, I very respect Microsoft company who develops VS Code, and they totally take into account almost every accessibility issue, every detail. They think about almost every common situations, while for some companies they lack this feature. So yeah, that's why I prefer VS Code instead of any other IDEs. So my programming stories, maybe just now enjoy working with PHP, especially Laravel, interested in backend, in the core backend. Interestingly, previous summer, we with my one friend just randomly thought, oh, why can't we learn Rust in a week or so? So we randomly chose to create a simple game. We made 2 different games and just did that in a week or so by following Rust tutorial. And just we have found out how difficult it is programming in Rust. But it was like a good experience to dig deeper into such a low level language, a little bit more difficult than other high level programming languages.
What kind of games were they? Audio games?
No, it was just simple command line games by pressing 1, 2, and happening with things. So just a quick turnaround of what could be done in Rust.
I should mention that Will McGugan has written a book on Pygame, the framework in Python for producing games. So,
yes, with Pygame,
Not very accessible.
I'm not saying it's not very accessible, but it's a sort of shows a breadth of interest. And well, in a sense, that's not very accessible, is an opportunity rather than a threat.
The Pygame is rather quite an accessible thing. No, not in all stages, but in autumn, I also have touched Pygame when needed to create a game for one of the subjects. And I chosen Flappy Bird and tried to implement it with the sounds. So
That's a very easy game.
Definitely went somehow, but actually is now incomplete because of lack of time. But the main idea is actually like present when the bomb is next to the player, the sound should be louder, but this actually required dealing with like sound positioning, which I'm not very strong at. So this feature left still under development, but maybe if I would have some maybe energy to continue this, I would be interested to complete it.
I'm going to make an administrative announcement because it's 1:30, and anybody that wants to stay, we're still recording. Anybody wants to stay and talk more, extremely welcome to stay. But anybody that feels they have to go, and we'll catch up the rest on video perhaps, is at complete liberty to leave. So I'll just have a few seconds, half a minute to catch our breath. And
well, I might have to hop off because I have something due this afternoon. I don't have to get on a meeting or anything, but I wanted to ask if I could get Palace's email, or if there's maybe Jonathan could.
I have emails for all three of you, so I can keep you in touch.
Very good. Yeah, very good. I feel like there needs to be more blind, like, you know, there's now a subreddit, but I don't know, that's not very good. And I feel like there need to be a few more spaces for blind programmers to communicate. You know, like I feel like I'm finding us in weird places all over the place, and everyone has their own kind of way of coming into the ecosystem. But I feel like we'd all benefit from more community.
I've got a suggestion about that, which is that we take Jonathan Godfrey at his word. We don't yet have really good sites that help blind programmers get started. If we can get a plausible project about helping blind programmers get started, and it doesn't have to do a great deal, it just has to show that it's got legs, then rather than choosing a place to meet to do something together. In other words, form a community around a project.
Maybe
I think there's a lot of space.
Sort of an international website for blind coders would be one of the opportunities.
Say that again.
Some sort of international website for blind programmers could be a maybe temporary solution for this problem, where all the things could be tackled in one place.
Or at least known about in one place. I mean, sometimes it's not enough. You don't need everything to be made in the same town, but you do want to have everything coming to the market where you go. So I want a sort of marketplace, a gathering place. I was surprised to learn that in classical Greek democracy, the agora was both the place where the people met for democracy and the marketplace. It just means the public square. So we sort of want a public square where public meetings can take place of blind people, blind programmers.
Yeah, I think this is worth a lot more discussion. And I know a few other blind programmers now, so, but you know, we're kind of very spread out. So, but anyway, I'm gonna hop off. But you know, Jonathan, I really appreciate the effort. You know, starting those bugs and everything like that. It's a lot of work, and you know, I like that you're kind of pushing back a little bit, and I think that's good. That's great work. So, and that's a really interesting edge case there that you found, that has been found there.
I think it's a case study. It's really interesting, and there's so much you can learn from it because we don't have many case studies like this.
I'm also not surprised that the attitude was just like, "Well, we don't really care about this." You know, so. But you know, I think that it's important work. So thank you for doing
What I found difficult about that, what I found hard work about that attitude was actually he was right. And rather than making it won't fix to not a bug was actually a really big advantage to me. Because by saying it's not a bug, you're saying not that the behavior is correct for the end user, but that component is correct and you don't have to mess with it. We'll solve it elsewhere.
That little caret is very annoying. That it's probably the least accessible thing about the error message. The little caret under the syntax error. You know, the traceback errors are more accessible, I think.
Okay, well now we've got it. We've got to let every Python developer know that that little caret is inaccessible. Bad caret, nasty caret. Carrots are supposed to make you see better, but this caret makes you blind.
All right.
Bad jokes, mate. If you remember bad jokes, you're okay. It's lovely to have you here, Patrick.
It's lovely to talk to you, Jonathan. I love it to meet you, Palias. And good seeing you again. Is it Nelson?
Me too. It's nice to meet you.
Yeah.
Have a lovely afternoon, Patrick.
All right. Cheers.
So we're down to 4. I think perhaps I should. Nelson, do you want to make any comments before I turn recording off? And the same goes to Paulius and William.
Yeah, the only thing I was going to comment on is that I've been around computers since the days of punch cards, and punch cards had numbered columns, and that led to designs of languages like Fortran, where certain columns were significant, assembly language, where things had to be, where say you had a label and an operation and an argument, and those had to be lined up in certain columns. But once Algol 58 came around in 1958, 2 years after Fortran, the designers realized that columns don't matter a whole lot. And as long as you can tell where things end, such as by introducing semicolons or periods, as COBOL did, then everything can be relatively free form. And most languages and input systems developed since the 1960s have largely not worried about columns. You still have aberrations like Fortran, which has a free form input, but still has a nasty limit on the length of a statement. And then Python comes along and makes leading space significant. And I viewed that as a terrible, terrible sin. Such a great sin that I refused to use the language, or at least write the language. I'm happy to use programs written in Python. It doesn't bother me, but I simply won't deal with the language where a change in indentation can change the meaning of code. I think that was a terrible, terrible design flaw. The Unix make utility has a little bit of an issue in that it has essentially rule lines, comment lines, dependency lines, and command lines. And command lines have to be indented by a tab, which on the screen looks like the same as spaces. And people who send a makefile and email may find the spaces have replaced tabs and changed the meaning of the makefile. But it's relatively easy to get used to it and fix it up with tools like the Unix expand and unexpand tools. But for the most part, I think we as designers ought to be thinking seriously about imposing draconian requirements such as particular indentation or particular columns in input fields, or offering web forms with boxes that have a very limited size. I recently hit this when we were preparing a proposal on a form that wouldn't let us have more than 300 characters in a project description, which turned out to be grossly inadequate. And also language designers need to think more seriously when they write grammars for programming languages. For example, if you write an if statement, you know that the next thing you're expecting should be an expression of some sort, perhaps surrounded by parentheses, as many languages require. Well, if you encounter the token if, and then what follows isn't an open paren or an expression, you ought to be able to tell the programmer, well, look, I've seen an if, and now I expect to find an expression. And you might even enumerate the possible things that might occur there. And mostly compilers don't. They tend to have fairly compact syntax error, compact messages like syntax error, which is not terribly helpful. Tech, for example, does complain if you don't have matched braces in your files, but it doesn't record the location of every open brace. It would have been a relatively small amount of memory, and I discussed this with Don Knuth once, but things were so tight in those early days that he didn't feel he could afford to keep a history of the braces. So when he finds a mismatched closing brace, or doesn't find one at all, Tech doesn't tell you where was the open one. And for that reason, I wrote the check dilim utility and bibparse for bibliography files to try to do a better job of reporting what's expected next. And if you have an unbalanced parenthesis or brace or something, to tell you where the open one was that you're expecting to find the closed one for. So I think there's a lot of work to be done yet. And I think when we design new things, we ought to think seriously about the importance of readable formats and formats that can be expressed not just visually, but also in audio form or in Braille form. So that's my comment.
It's got a very clear beginning and a very clear end, and the middle is also worthwhile. Thank you very much. Palius.
I definitely already said the things which I'm which I wanted to say. Just could try once again to say that I think one of the most required topics for today in terms of blind programmers and accessibility is to try to talk with other software developers and try to encourage them to maybe express the interest in making inaccessible software accessible. This means enabling the possibility to use apps or tools required for development which we can't now simply use, and just express the clearly try to explain them that making these tools accessible would change dozens of lives in those who are in development, and just somehow to express that as a real interest, that other developers could take it seriously and try to change it. So this would be a great step forward if some of the big companies would change their mind and just look back and just would say, stop, need to think about it, and just would do that. Because nowadays it seems that just a few of really big companies that powers great software really takes care about accessibility solutions, because for the rest of the companies, they just or don't require this or think that it is irrelevant for their users. So I think it's very important to change their minds in this field, and just we as a blind programmers community should think about the ways how could we extend this. What could we suggest for those companies to do to make their products more accessible?
So what you want is more doors to be open for communication between
just by talking about it clearly, by expressing the common and serious problems, and just maybe talk with those developers who may think that's not important, to try to persuade them that the situation is really serious and these accessibility features are really required. So somehow to try these developers to change their mind about the accessibility perspective in their products. I'm talking more about those maybe premium or paid products, because I see one great thing about open source community, where open source projects are much likely to be in a better position of accessibility because of open contributions. So if the project is open source, even people who don't know programming side very much, they can help contributing, for example, in documentation issues, in bug reports, and that's, in my opinion, what it makes open source community very great in such a way that lots of contributions could be made. And maybe that's one of the reasons why open source projects from one side are much more better accessible than some of the premium products, because lots of people could express the issues straight, for example, on GitHub or on a platform that the application is built, and then developers can just quickly see the problem and fix it. For example, I'm very proud of how VS Code development works. You submit the bug request or a feature, and one day after, you see it's now fixed. So that's an awesome job Microsoft does. So my maybe hope is to try to make it more general to other companies. For example, especially to JetBrains or Postman, who totally don't care about accessibility problems. So need to think about the ways, how could we persuade these developers to change their minds?
I think that is a very good point at which we can stop this tech hour. I think it's brought us to a very clear, very good conclusion. And as is often said, there is more work to be done. So thank you all for coming. And thank you to Patrick and Kelly, who came and are no longer with us. And next week we'll have something else. And in a month's time, we'll be doing accessibility again. I'm not sure what it will be, but I'm sure it'll be helpful.